Hello and welcome to the 1998 Triennial Meeting of the United Astrology Congress, held May 21st through the 27th in Atlanta, Georgia.
Everyone, thank you. I can't believe that we're all still here. That's what I'm speaking, right, and being as outrageous as to think that one can convey anything at this time. But I will certainly try. Now, this is material from the book Dynasty. For any of you who are readers, then that book has some of this material, and it's always a bit different, really, when you're speaking. And I don't like to repeat myself, but the thing about the title, the water houses, we always have these lovely romantic titles for our topics. The water houses as the ancestral eyes of the soul actually is a romantic title, but when I was writing the book, I was working on a chapter called The Fourth House, because that's kind of a mandatory thing when you're talking about families and so forth. So I thought, work on the fourth house. So I was, writing pretty reasonable material on the fourth house, but it just somehow wasn't quite coming together in the way that I felt the underlying and, kind of dimensional ramifications of families and groups and so on. Is the tape not on? Sorry. I can't talk any louder, so if there's no microphone, I don't know quite what to do. Is this not a mic as well? Is that better? God.
That's it.
Who? Find who? Yeah, you could all come and sit in a little clump at my feet. Anyway, look, I'll give it a try. How's that? Right, so working away on the fourth house, thinking, right, this is it, the origins and so on. But then I had a dream in the night, and in the dream I had written material on all three houses, the fourth and the eighth and the 12th. Now, there's no material in that dream. It's not like I, had a visitation or anything like that. But that next day, when I started to work, it became really evident that there was a tremendous amount of sort of womb-type material located in the three water houses. And if you think logically that, there's discussion about being in touch with the collective in the 12th, that the fourth is, the ancestral or place of origin, family of origin, the eighth house is inheritance, and generally inheritance in a regular form come through families. So it struck me, on a logical level, but also on a very deep level, that the three houses that were representative of water would have something to do with the way we arrived and the condition of the sort of the ethereal self and the soul. And they are the places of ancestral lineage. I mean, every house in the horoscope is relative to the family. I mean, it is the way a horoscope is. It defines all aspects of our being. However, these particular houses focus intently on the three levels of ancestral relationship. And again, I started with the 12th house to something different, and it wasn't a trick, but because it was the area that I feel is the primordial womb, wherein lie our personal connections to the great collective, the anima mundi, the soul of the world. And that realm, we are all one. And this is a great mystical teaching of all religions, that there is a place of unification. And even in a science model, it is a point of origin, wherein a unicellular organism begins to evolve, etc. And so the 12th house, I felt, was where we meet in a quantum level, where energy and matter are one, where the stuff and the matter of the world are actually redundant, and the transcendent exists outside of time, and there is an experience of that intrauterine and also, I guess, pre-birth in a soul condition. So from that place, though, we have to incarnate, come in through the flesh, incarnate, through a very specific womb, which is the mother, who houses us during the incubation in her own body, and that is the fourth house, the gene pool. And the gene pool of the family origin, which is really the astrological meeting place of the personal ancestors, that's where we become alive within the family and all around, and we meet ourselves in the souls of real people, of family individuals. And when we get through to the 8th house, we have a task of living with the dead, of living in company with those who have been part of our system, who were part of our own bodies and origins, and yet are no longer with us tangibly. And it's through this incarnate place that we individuate our personal ancestors, through the 8th house. And if we want to go a little more deeply, as I will, into each of these houses, I just wanted to give you the sort of logic behind the mystical side of it. In ancient astrology, the 12th house was always considered to be malign. It was the house of hidden enemies, of incarceration, insanity, self-undoing, usually brought on by influences way outside one's own control. In short, it was a terrible place. And in modern astrology, it still mainly is interpreted as such, in the sense that the 12th house is the house of sleeping characteristics and self-undoing, in a sense that, you know, when we consider enemies, the real enemy is usually within. And it's from that place that we will attract anything that attacks us or confines us or in any way limits our sphere of activity. And so in a way, too, the house is being called the collective unconscious. And I believe that to be the case, because it is the house in which archetypes are housed. In Shakespeare's work, he says, to sleep perchance to dream. And it's in the state of dreams, which is the 12th house, that we encounter the realms of archetypes. And the archetypes are really very much very large images of what we are and what we manifest. And those are, on some level, collective images of who we are. It's where we are connected. It's a place where all the origins of humanity reside. And so I would say this would be the ancestral site of the entire human race, to which we are deeply connected. It also could be the place of the reptile brain, where we have our instinctive, very deeply primordial instinctive reactions and responses, the animal self. Animal in that very intelligent way, though, the survival thing. We have a place where our darkest survival instincts are very active and functioning, and that is the 12th house. I mean, we know we have that because we dream of like gods and monsters and horizons with multiple suns or moons, you know, people that we know, but somehow they're behaving in ways which we don't understand. And this is all a reflection on some level of not just our own self. In fact, I think the 12th house is where we would meet those who are outside of ourselves, where we are all one. It's where we meet the ancestors of the entire human race, and possibly even the pre-human race, the sort of organism of humanity. And so therefore, all the ancient interpretations of the 12th house have relevance if we see it in this light, because deep in our own psyche, our own personal shadow stem from the origins of the human terror, of fear. And in the Dark Ages, it would have been a time when the origins of humanity still participated wholly and instinctually with the environment. There was no real sense of separation. And this, too, is the place where we find ourselves completely boundless, without any kind of containment or any kind of personality or ego. Transits through the 12th are usually quite disintegrative. And they're there for a reason, because the transits, as they move through the 12th, are going to give rise to all sorts of issues that have to do with the letting go of the ego in order for the first house to be presented with something fresh and new. And very often people are quite frightened or lost, particularly during transits like Saturn through the 12th. There's an intent there. It's not about being punished or that you've been evil in a past life. I mean, you'd have to go through your life perhaps 2 or 3 times. Saturn might go through the 12th house. And in each of those times, one would recognize that there is a distinct drop of identity and a confrontation with a side of the self that has never been met. And you can't say that it's not you, because we can't have anything happen to us that's out of character. And so this business of trying to get to the point of what is this, and this area of the 12th house, in the ancient word incarceration, if we take the literal meaning, it means to be trapped, to be held back, to be contained. And incarceration and incarnate are close. They're not related, but they're close words. And the soul is in fact enfolded into the body, and it is incarcerated. And I think, too, that the word insanity, which has been brought up with the 12th house, is also fitting, because a person who has lost this very, very tentative boundary between the consensus reality and what is comfortable, where there's no real feeling for, the social, civilized aspect of life, that person has tipped into a psychosis. And I think that this is a place where the individual meets the archetypes and actually identifies with them so strongly that they lose their concept of self. And so it is madness, but it is not something that our society values in any way, whereas at one point and at various times in civilization, this state was considered to be holy. It wasn't medicated. It was holy. The thing of it is, though, it's like being returned to this infantile state where you're in the womb. And I'm sure that many of us have had experiences where one or our parents or friends' parents have become senile or become affected by Alzheimer's, and it's like a return to the womb, where the folding of the ego goes back into the soul, and there's no connection between the self and the outer world. And this isn't considered to be dangerous. It's sad, but the fact is that person has simply gone back to meet, before they left the body, the ancestral realm, and therefore should be respected rather than feared. And in some way there is a holiness to this. The Platonic picture tells of the soul making a journey through the underworld after departing the body. Now, Plato was a philosopher. I'm sure you all know who he was, but the most interesting story in one of the books of the Republic is the story of a man who dies and comes back and tells what happened. And once the soul departs, it has to transition through the underworld and meets various experiences, undergoing trials, all of which are tailored perfectly to the incarnate soul's previous experiences and are designed to prepare the soul for its next incarnation. One of the last trials of this liminal or transitioning soul is to cross a blazing hot plain, which is called the Plane of Oblivion in English, and reach a river of the same name, the river Lethe. And Lethe in Greek is the root of our word lethal. And the Plane of Oblivion, or the Plane of Lethe, and then the river Lethe, is where Plato advises the soul to drink not too deeply from this river Lethe, lest it encourage oblivion or forgetfulness, which was one of Plato's, or Socrates' greatest sins, was to forget. And that the whole of life was what we call anamnesis, a way of recalling, of remembering, of awakening, constantly awakening every day to where you were and where you are. That we can recall from our ancestors, if you will, to make it a little harder, a little more real, who we were, who all of us are, and where we're going. And so the 12th house, it could be a very deep source of purpose, of we're supposed to be. I've often found that planets that are in the 12th house, people who have this, whether they have lots or one or two, that those planets sometimes have a hard time contacting external agencies or energies with which to manifest what's going on in the energy of the planet. And the planet doesn't agent the self quite as well until well into maturity. I mean, 12th house planets in some way are the last to be born, in that they remain enwombed and in gestation and in formation. And people very frequently with 12th house planets have a tremendous sense of something huge and yet find it difficult to articulate that. And I think that too is part of this business of being in touch with the collective humanity. And because that's something that is so huge and vast, it's not as easy to actually be able to image it in the outer world or in the daily life as the other houses are, the 4th and the 8th. We're getting a good microphone suddenly. Wow, now I can kind of relax. And so I think, too, that the only way to consciously connect with the planets in the 12th is to mythologize or spiritualize or universalize them. And hence we get the people who are named psychics, astrologers, visionaries, priests, and people who are in deep relationship with the divine, because the comfort zone in sort of present here and now individuals is a little difficult. So there is that introversion, and it's to be respected. I mean, our society praises, or at least particularly Western society, praises the extrovert. Everyone is supposed to be an extrovert. There's an attempt these days, especially with drugs, which is a 12th house thing, to flatline emotionally, so that everyone is the same. And if we were all taking the same drug, it would make society a lot easier, because then there wouldn't be much conflict, you see. There wouldn't be individuation and personality. And so the 12th house is a place of fear for people who are not intrepid. And so any of you who have 12th house planets, you should go home and sit quietly and thank something, the divine, if you will, for giving you this contact with a place wherein many people don't like to go, and find a place to be comfortable. I find that it does take years of maturity or possibly transits, sometimes progressions, you know, use the astrology to the degree you have it, to wake up and mature or evolve the planets that are in the 12th house. I think people with that need a really good focus on a really good obsession. And in that, can actually find a channel instead of this vague, wonderful, you know, amorphous, nebulous place. So it's essential, really, that it takes very conscious effort to individuate out of this and to give birth to oneself in a second form. And sometimes people are constantly giving birth to themselves. And in mythology and in religion, the twice born is a religious experience. And 12th house people very often do have to go within and without often. And for them, life is very much like having to give birth to themselves over and over. So if you think in terms of the infant in its birth stage, that, you know, we set our horoscopes where the ascendant marks the time, which means anything in the 12th house was rising all through the latter part of labor and then suddenly is arrested, using that very figuratively, in the 12th house. So everything stops at that place, and the person has a great back memory. And so it's uncomfortable. Often there's a feeling of being haunted. And I think that haunting is something that, again, that our civilization, in its anxiety, has made creepy and weird, so that you don't want to acknowledge death or dead people. They aren't cool. And but other cultures, especially the Aboriginal cultures or the First Nation cultures, they walk with the ancestors all the time. It's not creepy and weird. And you know, I'm not sort of thinking that one should run off and be sort of doing rituals to the dead and that, but why not? I mean, it makes it more comfortable. And I think, too, that because of this concept of wanting to go back to the cosmic womb, that the pain of being conscious and alive can sometimes be overwhelming. And it takes long periods of withdrawal and contemplation. As I say, the introvert is a very valid type of person. And we need, all of us, whether we've got planets in the 12th house or not, to be in that safe and quiet place to create that. And that's why people meditate, dance, do art, watch TV, you know, whatever it is that allows you to just vegetate and go into your 12th house zone. Then often we'll find that there are secrets somewhere in there that we can get to and unlock, which will, when I get to the fourth house, talk a bit more about that. Because 12th house planets also speak very loudly about secrets in the family. There's a potential here for unlocked or unspoken hatred or anxiety in the family. And it could also mean that the person who has particular planets in the 12th house is here to unlock those secrets and to work them through for the family. I mean, we aren't separated. We are really bound into our families by not just genetics, but also in a very soulful type of DNA. And therefore, we must be here for a reason. Part of the reason is to improve it by that much. And there are always secrets. They're not always dark. But sometimes they're quite amazing when they come out. And the 12th house person will usually know they're there. And they do tend to kind of poke at the rest of the family to bring it out. So they're kind of uncomfortable sometimes. But I've also found that the 12th house planets feel lonely. And if you focus too much on that side of it, then the whole of yourself feels lonely. When in fact, it really is perhaps just one aspect of the self that's in some way much less individuated and not as formed as the ego would like it, as society would like it. And so you do feel lonely and set apart. And relationships are not enough, like, you know, male, female, 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 male, male, the sort of organic relationships don't quite assuage this loneliness. This is a cosmic loneliness. It's a kind of, I guess we just have to call it, homesickness for the divine, really. And relationships are much better in this zone, not to say that you can't have a carnal or a biblical relationship, but it means that the relationship with God is much more profound and more satisfying in a whole sense when there are a collection of or very significant planets in the 12th house. And blending the split, for example, let's say of a life path and a spiritual life, is actually easier for planets in the 12th house because there is no differentiation. As I said, it's a quantum place where matter and time are exactly the same, and energy and matter are not separated. And so 12th house people are very monk-like. The singularity isn't the existential despair, for instance, that besets 8th house planets, or the carrier and the isolation of the family fate in the 4th, but it's more of this cosmic loneliness, which is the making of monks and spiritual religious. And this business of being deeply connected to the nuclear family of origin, I think gives them, the 12th house, the region wherein we can spiritualize our families, especially if there's been a lapse or a loss of faith. Orthodoxy is very important in lineage, because when I talked about Jupiter, I mentioned how necessary it is for us to find places that are safe to put our relationship with the divine, because most people can't handle the existentialism. And so a lot of times I've found people who have rejected or lapsed from a very long line of orthodoxy, whether it's Judaism or Islam or Christianity, and in fact actually need to go back into it in order to redeem part of themselves, because their connection may be through the family line, which was abominated in some way in the 4th house, but that they have this 12th house calling to go back in, cleanse, and bring it into a relationship with themselves, and then move on. They may not necessarily stick with it, but to flee or reject or cut any kind of religious form that is really strong in the family, anyone with 12th or 4th house planets seems to be the one in the family who is bound to connect it back again and bring it up to date, so to speak. Now, see, I can't do everything in an hour and 15 minutes. I will talk a wee bit about this business of the 12th house being jail. I mean, that's pretty common, isn't it? That if you've got a lot of planets in the 12th house, you're either going to be going to the madhouse or to jail at some point in your life. And yet, I mean, my own personal feelings about being incarcerated is I do it to me. And I don't really need to go to jail to be locked away, shut up, isolated, and so on. And the age-old tradition of putting all 12 planets in jail, literally in prison, I think there is some justification. As there's justification for the substance abuser being found in the 12th house and along with the mad person. All of these conditions remove the ego. And there is no ego in the 12th house. There's no identity. In the strongly individuated sense, for example, of a prisoner. They become a number. The mad person or the stoned person. There is no clear boundary. They have all been swallowed by the collective. Again, this is part of that containment that the collective has without giving any sense of identity. But on the purely psychological level, I think it is a problem. But on the spiritual level, it's a problem within society. See the difference? I mean, it's important that we recognize and honor that there are other realities and dimensions so we don't partake in, thank goodness, or this room would be pandemonium. So we're all somewhat contained, everybody looks pretty sane. God knows that one of you may just sort of begin to run amok any second. But, you know, in which case we'd all have to follow, you know, what I'm just saying about honoring this person. So if anybody feels like having a psychotic episode, we could test our capacity to honor your madness. And it is wonderful to be a philosopher and so forth, but, you know, when we run into it in the street, it can be really quite frightening, but it's an opportunity to look at yourself. We all read the paper and see tragedy and horror, and some people don't want to do this, but many people do try and explore that and say, could I do that? You know, where did this come from? You know, does this person represent, who has committed a horrible crime or something, represent an aspect of me as a member of the human race? I think recognizing the shadow is a very important thing, because then it reduces the terror. It also reduces the chance of the shadow constellating really firmly. Perhaps our ignoring of the dead and the ancestors and the messages that are trying to come through now with Pluto in Sagittarius sounds to me like, you know, the ancestral league, Pluto in Sagittarius, the messages from the dead, they're trying to get through to us to say, look, it's time to begin to acknowledge the teachings from the ancient and the recent world in order for us to make the jump forward that is going to be demanded within the next probably 10 to 20 years. And so this business of ignoring the dark and the shadow isn't very productive. This business of Prozacking everybody into a state of somnolence isn't very productive. Anxiety is a drag. Depression is a drag, but sometimes it is an important function in health. And so some people are anxious and depressed or have symptoms because the 12th house is picking up what the collective is experiencing. And the collective is experiencing a tremendous anxiety because it's changing. And, you know, clients come to me and they're saying, I'm so anxious. And I say, well, you should be. You're changing. I mean, anxiety is an alarm clock. It's saying, wake up, don't be sleepy, be vigilant, be observant. But we've translated into anxiety. It's unacceptable, and therefore we must go into the 12th house and go to sleep. Now, I'm not saying that you should run around in a state of terrible anxiety, because if you need to be calmed down, you should do something about it. But recognize that there's some levels of ego development that require a little bit of attention and anxiety. Now, I don't have the time in this session to go through each of the planets in the in the houses, but what I want to do is go through the three, and then if we have a few minutes left, I'd be happy to sort of take a poke at a few individual planets. Now, from the 12th house, I want to read, just to finish it up, a quote from Carl Jung, which I really enjoyed this one. All consciousness separates, but in dreams we put on the likeness of that more universal, truer, more eternal man dwelling in the darkness or primordial night. There he is still whole, and the whole is in him, indistinguishable from nature and bare of all egohood. That's a pretty healthy way of describing the significance and the importance of letting go of self-definition in order to give birth to whomever you are about to become. In order to actually give birth, become born in this sense of as a baby, Joseph Campbell has a wonderful quote that I think relates beautifully to the 4th house, which is the ancestral family of origin. And Joseph Campbell writes, and this is out of the Hero with a Thousand Faces, full circle from the tomb of the womb to the womb of the tomb we come, an ambiguous, enigmatical incursion into a world of solid matter that is soon to melt from us like the substance of a dream. Amazing man, really. Now, in the strictest sense of meaning, the 4th house of the horoscope does mean our home. In other words, our address and our business card and our relationship with our little nest. However, in the global community, home actually may not mean the 4th house in the chart. I mean, that is that we may not live in the land of our nativity, and many of us don't, because we live in a different kind of world than we did 60 years or 100 years ago. So the old saw that we are judged in the land of our nativity really means that no matter where we go, there we are, 4th house and all. So we carry it around with us. You can relocate charts and do all that, which I do, but you still have your 4th house where it was when you were born, and it's here. And it's tenanted, the 4th house, by all your family members who have come down the line to meet in the parents and result in you. So there's this great parade of personal ancestors that I directly descended, the bloodline descended, not laterally as it runs from cousins to uncles and so forth, but literally down through the meeting place of your family, your background. So it is the lineage of your mother and your father, and it is also the future, because it means that through you can come the progeny of the future. Whether you choose to have children is another story, but that is what lies in the 4th, is that potential. And the 4th house, I think, is the greatest personal mystery. Experiences occur there which never reach consciousness, and clusters of planets around the IC can actually add to the mystery of it rather than explain it. It's sort of, if you have your son at the IC, it doesn't really make everything all that clear. My friend Melanie Reinhardt, who wrote Chiron, we call the IC the I don't see, because it's like, what's this? And it's like the roots of a great ancient tree, in the sense that our own source of deep earthy nourishment and lifeblood is underground. It's hidden and protected from the light of day. You expose roots to the sun, they wither and they dry. It's meant to be hidden. It's meant to be kept secret and nurtured, like the infant in the womb, like a secret that's meant to be kept until it becomes mature, like a film in a camera. In camera means in secret, entombed. And many, in the same mysterious way as the tree, our own lives grow and branch, and our roots sink deeper and more resiliently each day, adding more growth to the external part that's visible. But it is that aspect of the secret and the nurture that we don't see that actually really feeds the family root. Now, many cultures place a great deal of emphasis, as I mentioned, on the ancestral spirits, and their daily lives include their forebears in ways that seem superstitious or sentimental to some people, and yet these Aboriginal cultures do this not out of fear but out of respect. And the family, in our sense, as we see it these days, and as it changes, and as it's supposed to change, I'm not against change at all. I mean, I don't know what 200 years is going to be in the way of how we express ourselves. I can't say that it would be wrong, but I think that the alienation that people experience from their families is a problem, and it may be a problem that we're just all in transition, as a collective, and therefore, and finding new ways to deal with family. But I don't think that, so much of it is that we don't respect our ancestors, because we do, but it's usually in rather superficial ways, like the great-great-grandfather who came across the ocean and, started with a business of match company or something like that, and, became a multimillionaire, or, the heritage from Holland, where we are, respectful of our homelands and our ancient past. But when we're considering the aspects of an individual's nature and concentrating on the natal horoscope, we may run up against some really mysterious blockages that we can't explain. There may be a kind of haunting or a deep sadness that can't be completely accounted for in the psychology of the immediate family. There are plenty of families that are benign. They're not all horrible. Families aren't pathological. But there's sometimes inexplicable unhappiness or complexes or neuroses that seem to be manifesting in ways which don't relate to any kind of overt trauma. This may be a result of it jumping a generation, or there having been a problem in the grandparents, for example, or in the great-grandparents. So that we can actually look more deeply in analysis, or in the psychological sense, and a spiritual sense too, at what kind of a secret or a mystery may be locked in the family, vault, that everyone's completely innocent of. They don't know. Your mother and father didn't do it. Maybe your grandparents didn't do it. But maybe the great-great-grandparents had something to hide. And so I think if we were only capable of, but nature prevents it sometimes, because of the order of nature, that parents die before children actually get to the age where they can ask the kind of questions that they really want to ask. And so there is always going to be this aura of mystery in the families. That's why I'm saying families are not all nests of vipers. I don't believe that, but I do think that somehow nature has made it so that we are not ever going to really get to the bottom of it. But astrology is very useful, because if you have a planet or so in the fourth house, if you really explore it, you may get to a place where you understand more about what the family complexes are, or where someone perhaps didn't fulfill some kind of destiny or fate in the family, and it's up to you to do it. And I think a lot of people who have strong, especially planets like, say, Pluto or Sun, Saturn, or the Moon, they carry important messages from the past, the ancestral line, the bloodline, into the current life in order to work with it, in order to make the family fuller, richer, cleaner, or break a curse. I mean, in the old Greek sense, the dynastic line was something to be, terrified of. I mean, awful things went on down through generations. And I guess they still do, actually. I mean, from my practice, I think they do, absolutely. And that there are some individuals who are born to hold a very high charge, and they always know it from very early age. And that they are the ones who are born in order to transform, or to alter, or in some way absorb, or maybe even step up the level in the family. And I'm sure that, everybody in this room is involved with a family. Have you ever noticed how that when one person changes, everybody changes? And if you look for the common transits, everybody's not going to have Saturn conjunct their sun, when, say, father has a heart attack and everybody goes into crisis and so on. But one person might have Uranus conjunct Venus, and the other one might have Saturn opposite Mars. But they'll all have a very significant transit in the family if there's an event. And it simply means that each individual within that collective is performing their own work in order to, undergo and to reconnect with that family. So it's not like, it just doesn't happen. It's very rare that everybody would get the same transit. It would be a bit of a joke. But the thing about families is that always a common thread. And after the Jupiter lecture, someone came up with this lovely graph of all the connecting planets in the family. And I think that's a very good, very healthy thing to do, to just check out your fourth house. Draw a grid. Put all of your planets like you would in an aspect grid, like that, and then the family names, and say mother and father and sister and brother and other sister, etc. May have Moon Uranus conjunction, Moon Uranus opposition, that kind of thing. Look for the theme. And then when you see the theme, because there will be one, concentrate on your own relationship within that planetary theme. It might be Sun Mars, it might be Moon Uranus, it might be Sun Saturn, it might be Venus Moon. And then you see, well, look at your chart and say, well, there I have a Venus Moon sextile, and everybody else has a Moon Venus opposition in a square. So, you know, don't say, oh, that means I'm more integrated and healthy. In the feminine sense, it means that you are the one responsible to help try and meet the opposition in the family and work through that. Yes?
Is there often one member of the family who is excluded from that theme?
Oh, yeah. I don't know about often, because, I mean, that would be vast research. But yes, I've seen it. There is sometimes, and frequently, there is a person who is a circuit breaker or a black sheep or a visitor. And those people, well, they don't feel lonely. They're just sort of curious, you know. They find it very odd that they're in this bunch of people that seem sort of to be carrying on a drama or a life outside of what their purpose is. I usually find that to be kind of interesting and healthy. This lady that brought me the graph, her mother was the one who was different than everyone else. And I thought, that's interesting that this woman has married and given birth to people who have a very common link, and she kind of stands there as the conduit. And, you know, there must be some kind of purpose and intent. That's the kind of thing that, as an astrologer, I might explore in a reading, but it's actually the thing that you, the person, ought to explore, because you're the one that's going to know. You'll find out what that is. But there are also times when families, and this is where the fourth house is very interesting as well, are kind of lumbering toward extinction, that they've become so bland, or they've become so passive, that they stop reproducing in a way which is dynamic and vital. And so we may have like a family of Pennsylvania Dutch that have been very, very content, and everything is super lovely, and it's all very wonderful. And one of them will marry an Italian. And that brings in some spice, and it shocks the whole family. They suddenly have to deal with an outsider. There's another language involved. There are different customs. There is another religion. And it enlivens everyone. They might be in a turmoil. They may disapprove. They may love it. They may, who knows, but it's changed them. And that's important, because families do terminate. I mean, there are endings, the last of the line. And in Dynasty, a friend of mine is the one who is the last in the line in her story of the South African. And there is a huge responsibility, a great well of psychic deposits and physical deposits that rest in the soul of a person who is the last person to carry the family. Can you imagine what that must be like? It's like having absolutely everything within you that ever existed, but nowhere to pass it on. So it can be very congested and uncomfortable. So, you know, the whole concept of a family, dying out or having, constant impact and threat. For instance, I used the Kennedy family just briefly in the index because, we're all pretty familiar with the Kennedys. They're a very powerful, very creative family, constantly marrying, bringing in new blood, and yet at the same time having to fight this dreadful fate wherein, madness and cancer and sort of homicidal things going on all the time. That family, it was constantly on the brink of extinction until this new generation. But it was close to extinction. And so, through the drug deaths and, really extreme experiences, some of them, the younger ones particularly, have really moved out and taken it upon themselves to individuate and change by being benefactors and so on, to change the family. That's a huge example. Most of us don't have these dramatic dynastic things that are very public, but we all have dramatic dynastic things that are private. And I think you can explore that, pretty quickly in your own minds. Now, I think, for instance, the more complex the immediate family is, especially if it's really malignant, the more important it is that the fourth house be considered as a larger container than the immediate family. There are times when you have to externalize and get out of this idea that your family is the only influence on you. And the family of humanity is important. We seek outside our family for that which is familiar, so that we find sometimes more nourishment in family of friends. But you're still going to find your family there. It's very interesting to watch your family sitting around the board of directors table at the work, and your role in that group being very similar to the one you play at home. Perfect opportunity to be able to work through any complexes or neurotic traits that you have without the blood tug. See, it's the blood aspect, that intimacy that brings up rage and repetitive patterns. If we can work it out socially through our friends, processing or analysis, however you choose, then it's a lot easier. But you're still within your family. You will never, ever escape it because that's who you are. But we will meet almost everywhere. I know I do. I don't know if, you know, it's a little embarrassing and usually kind of funny sometimes. So if we think in terms of, it's not just mom and dad and our brothers and sisters, but it is an expression of a much larger container, and that the family of humanity is also part of us, then we're not quite so infantilized. And this kind of thinking, in other words, I mean, I'm finding this, that younger people, younger than me, in other words, anybody under 30, don't think the same way as my generation. I was born in 1947. They just don't think the same way. There's not as much blame laid on the family as the source of all neurosis. They're more aware that there is a bigger issue at large now, and that being planetary safety. So there's not so much I mean, they're aware that their parents, you know, blew it here or served them there, but they're not spending as much time in analysis, in therapy, you know, focusing on themselves and what mommy and daddy did. And I think this is really an interesting kind of transition, you know, toward a healthier collective, in that the family is no longer necessarily, I mean, the actual blood family of origins, going to be that influential in the creation of madness and dangerous people and so on. There's a big worry at hand here as to whether your mom and dad really cared about you or not. And on some level, I think this is going to be part of the evolution, is that we'll be able to release ourselves and also our progeny in the future from being Freudian, basically, where it's all Oedipal and all that kind of stuff. So there's more dangerous things afoot than mommy and daddy in the world right now. So fortunately, psychoanalysis is you know, going to have to change or die. And astrology becomes even more interesting as a tool because it allows for the individual to be expressed in a multiplex way as opposed to a modular way. And so when we explore families through horoscopes, we're going to be, I think, relieved of a certain level of responsibility, but actually more accountable. And there's a big difference there between taking on the responsibility of the family. Because I think you know, I have to give some credit to the Pluto and Leo generation for having done so much work. I mean, my daughter said, you guys did all that work. We don't have to do it. They have Pluto in Virgo and Uranus in Libra, these two. And their friends all do, and many of your children will be in that particular group, and some of you are in that group. And it's true that we get navel-gazed and obsessed and focused on ourselves and individuated to the point where we've become alienated from the collective, I think perhaps as a gift to the next generation, so they don't have to do it. That they can get on with the business of fixing the world. And they can stop blaming everybody else for what's going on, except the legacy is a little tough that we've left. Now, time is it? Am I done at noon? Is that how it goes? 10:45. Oh, good. All right. think more about this business of wombs and things, because that's what I think the fourth house is. As Joseph Campbell said, the tomb of the womb to the womb of the tomb. You know, it's the place where the whole recognition, soulful recollection of everything that's related to the bloodline is there, and therefore this is easy to transpose onto the mother. Now there's always, well not always, but certainly there's been, in the last 10 years or so, a kind of question as to whether the 10th house is the mother or the father, and you know that one, we've tried to pass that one around. It's very difficult to determine, because I can't with my own horoscope, and I've looked at my kids and all sorts of clients, and it seems that there's a lot of interaction. Somehow both my parents fit beautifully into either house, and sometimes more strongly at certain phases in my life than others, which is why I've taken the safe place of saying that it is the family, and therefore your mom and dad can be there anytime they want, and everybody else is there too. And then your midheaven and your 10th house being the expression, the externalization of the values of the family, of the security that you would have or not developed, and that what you do in the 10th house is a public recognition, which is not always paternal, especially these days, you know, with things changing. And the recognition in the 10th house is the overt expression of that thing you have inside in the soul that has come down through the family line. And I think that by the time we sort of consider the 8th house, because I, again, can't do the planets, that we're looking at history, or I should say, legacies that are passed into the immediate family from the ancestors that are directly linked to the family of origin. So we're not, again, we're looking at the dynastic line as it meets in you in the fourth, but we also can consider now the lateral connections, like uncles, cousins, you know, some very distant individuals that are patterning into your family line. And the 8th house is the ancestral legacy, because we've always thought the 8th house is inheritance, and it is. You know, it's where we receive benefit from those who have gone beyond, who are present us with gifts. Sometimes it has to do with an investment that we might have made where we reap the benefits through taxing. I mean, all of the old signatures to the houses are not defunct just because there are new ones that are being brought in. After all, we are developing better, more interesting, and more relevant vocabularies. So I'm not really saying anything new, but just saying it in a way which is probably more up to date. Now, I thought I'd be a bit witty about this 8th house, because everybody's always a bit creeped out about dead people and things like that. And George Bernard Shaw says, if you can't get rid of the family skeleton, you might as well make it dance. And I sort of, as a Scorpio, I always think, yeah, right, well, we might as well, because it's not going anywhere. Every time you open that door, there it is, clacking away. And so in the 8th house, relative to the 4th, moving on, we find the inheritance that we have been left by our ancestors. Now, collecting that inheritance has stringent rules. As with all points of law, one can only receive one's due process by applying through the right system. As with the previous watery domains, the 12th and the 4th houses, this house speaks of our family lineage, but does so through symbols and ciphers and metaphors. This is the house of astrology in many ways. All of the water houses are particularly cryptic. They're mysterious, they're unreadable. But none of these houses is so dedicated to the use of synchronicities, images, messages, ciphers, and so on as the 8th house is. And we do connect deeply to the archetypal collective symbology in the 12th house of dreams, but it's in the 8th house where we are one with our personal ancestry. So the 12th is us and every human soul that has ever existed and actually potentially will exist, whereas the 8th house stops with us. It's our personal ancestors. And they come in many voices, many languages, and they've actually become an aggregate of the complex of the family archetype. And periodically, one of them will individuate enough through you to actually hand you a very specific trait or talent or message that you must become the artist in the family because everybody else was an accountant. And you had some sort of mad uncle, 3 generations back who, fell apart and began painting or something and was ostracized. And you happen to be born into a collective where it's quite hip to be an artist. So you get that legacy. This uncle has come through you to say, look, this is a chance. Give me life. See, they don't like to be dead necessarily in the sense of gone, but they'd like you sometimes to carry either a message further, individuate it more clearly, articulate some kind of gift. It isn't just what is left to you in someone's will. The 8th house is the Pontifex Maximus. Now that's the fancy term for the Pope, but in this case I mean the big bridge. And it's between the deeper self and ego and the ancestors. Now in the Catholic religion, as I mentioned, the Pope is considered to be the Pontifex, and the pharaohs of Egypt were also the Pontifex. However, now we have taken it upon ourselves to be our own bridge. And therefore, people with planets in the 8th house are specifically both blessed and cursed with this bridge-making role. Now, none of the water houses are rational. No state of synthesis is achieved through reason, really. It's through a very synthetic process. The word itself, symbol, connect one half of something with another. The word actually derives from the Greek symbolon, which was an object, such as a bone or a stick or a piece of pottery, which would be broken in two. And then one half would be given to one person and another to another person. Now, this would be done in secret, because the idea was this is how, secret societies transferred messages from one place to another, like the Pythagoreans, for example. And the order of the secret society would then, when they met that individual and was supposed to transfer the message, when they put the two pieces together, fitting both halves, brought about a meeting in which the mysteries known only to them in the higher order could then be shared. So that a secret code could then be transmitted. And it brought together the necessary components to create communication of mysterious types. So symbol is really about throwing two things together that meet perfectly, and out of that comes a moment of truth. And so people who think symbolically and who live deeply ritualistic lives and who really appreciate the preparation for communication with the divine or the higher levels are people who are receiving information from the ancestral line. And they are also people who are very 8th house. Now, the interesting thing about this business of going on about symbols again, the holders of each half of this icon or whatever it was, bone or whatever, each of them knew themselves to be true. They were the holders of the right thing. But only when those two pieces would fitted perfectly would each then know that their opposite was true also. So it's in the 8th house that we meet our opposite. And in the meeting of oppositions, it's where that recognition occurs, that Carl Jung felt, for example, that the two extreme moral poles of good and evil were capable of reconciliation. And that by suffering the tension of opposites in full consciousness could bring about the transcendence of both. It's like a mysterious marriage of soul. So that by the conscious work and effort toward the reconciliation of good and evil within the self, which is very 8th house, that a truth would emerge and that it would become null. It would become pure energy. And therefore, I think any of you 8th houser types probably are very aware of what I'm saying. And that the fullness of knowledge and the reconciliation of opposites occurring in the 8th house is a transcendent function, and it really is achieved symbolically. It also generates a problem of the split between the ego and the self, which we call good and evil. Now, the ego isn't evil, it's just a worldly thing. But still, the self and the ego need to meet in order to be true. Sometimes if we're going through like a very big transition, or there's been a shock or a loss, or somehow we are just maybe undergoing lots of Uranus or Neptune transit, and we've lost our sense of who we were. That's actually a healthy and very holy state in the ancient world, and I think still today. It's just that it's really hard to deal with in a social context. People don't like it, it scares them. They don't like it when you're different. You don't like it when you're different because you'd rather just be who you used to be. And, but there's something sacred about going through transition and living in a liminal space, because this is where the gods come in. And they come in full force, and they are helpful. And that's where we get into magical acts. We pray, we throw the I Ching, we look at the ephemeris. We just, everything means something. The phone rings, right, as a symbol. You pick out something to wear, and my gosh, there's this thing in the pocket that you didn't find. This means something. We become really magical in times where we have no identity. This is a good thing. This is what you're supposed to do. And again, it's not socially comfortable, but then our society doesn't recognize it. And it can make you anxious and feel horrible and frightened, and you ring up your friends and say, I'm having a nervous breakdown, and this is happening. Try and contain it, because there's a lot of power in it, a lot of self-power. There are a couple of your friends that will understand, but most people won't. They'll be bored and annoyed with you. It's sort of like trying to tell somebody what an acid trip is like. Wow. And they go, really? But those days are long gone. Now we have to just try and tell them how we feel. God. Telling somebody how you feel, isn't that something to try and express it? I guess that's why we have poetry and music and hugs. That's about it. But this business of life and death, which is where we meet our opposite. And we live with this every day. We live with the tension of life and death. And as animals, we are the only ones who actually do that, which is why I think we love animals, because they're just so sweet. They just wander around. They're not all worrying about when they're going to die and whether they're fat or anything like that. And Freud was really into the whole idea of Eros and Thanatos, the life force and the death force, struggling with each other. And when life meets with death, a symbol arises. And the symbols that we employ, for instance, to resurrect the dead, pictures, talismans, heirlooms, you have something precious of your grandmother's. These are really important and valuable talismanic symbols for ancestral contact. And the use of these sort of mementos or icons or totems, it isn't sentimental, but more sacramental. And the 8th house contains all of the elements for religious sacramental ritual. And I think we can ritualize our daily lives and live in accord with a long line of progenitors, because we're all going to have done, we're all going to do it very differently. And that's why it's hard sometimes to fit into an orthodoxy. We can find a sense of inner harmony, which gives us a sense of relaxed social harmony. And because Pluto and Scorpio are associated with the 8th house, it is a memento mori, a reminder that we will meet the end, the terminus, and therefore need to live in harmony with that reality. I was very touched by, touched is such an empty word, but of the video last night of Marion March, whom I have known for years, whom many of us have known for years, worked with for 25 to 30 years. She looked beautiful, very beautiful woman. Hard to believe that she is that ill, because it is just really the end. And it's so reassuring when someone speaks so healthily about life, because that is what she was talking about, was life. And I just think there's something remarkable about saying, well, look, let's get rid of the tubes and the oxygen and all of that and put on my makeup and let me just talk to people. And that, to me, was a very, very significant meeting of Eros and Thanatos, of life force and death, to give forth a message. And at this conference, we experienced that. A lot of our astrology leaders die, but you don't often get a chance to actually have a witness to a truth. And that doesn't mean that she wouldn't be frightened at times, sad, furious, and all of that. But basically, that's really the truth, that what she spoke, was that it's a good life, a good family, hard work, time to go, one gets old. And so it wasn't very scary, was it? I mean, I didn't see anybody feel terrified. And I felt that she really gave everyone a real gift by doing that. Because a lot of our friends have died, and it's been private. Well, there were opportunities, for instance, to share that. Yeah. Very dignified. Oh, absolutely. It really was. It just made one feel really kind of safe, you know? Yeah.
Give an example of whatever planet in the eighth. Saturn in the eighth, Mars in the eighth.
Well, for example, let's say if you have Mars in the eighth, because I can think of a few incidents of that. She was saying just one example, because I've just been given the sign of 10 minutes. Just an example, for example, if you have a planet in the eighth house. I would say, for example, Mars. Let's say you have Mars in the eighth. It does imply that there's a long line of warriors in the background, and that these warriors, because it's in the eighth, have been suppressed, and that there may be a lot of swallowed rage or undercurrents of anger in the family that manifests as passive aggression. Because the water houses are quiet and they're suppressed. This is the hidden stuff, right? And if you've got Mars in the eighth, then it would mean that it's really up to you to come conscious with this, and not to be a victim, and also not to be a violent perpetrator, but to somehow individuate rage into a life force as opposed to a death wish. Do you see? It's kind of like that. It might be clear, like in Dynasty, where you read little bits, because that's cookbooky stuff, but it is like that. You use the basic fundamental knowledge of the house and its realm, and the energy or agency is a better word of the planet, and how is it you're going to get into the ritual, the symbol, the meeting of opposites, the understanding of what, if it's the sun, long line of heroes, and yet you may be very shy. What do you do with all this profound, powerful life force when it's hidden away in the eighth house? So it's important to find out where your hero within is able to emerge and come out, probably in a very analytic way, because it's the eighth house. So someone there is giving a message. Someone way back. Well, Pluto would be a collective issue. It's a little less personal if it's connected to a personal planet, like the Sun or Venus or something like that. But I would say that there may have even been like a death right around the time of the birth. Like if Pluto is in the fourth, very often somebody has died right around the time of the birth, like the father of the birthing mother, or there was a sibling that had died previously, either stillborn or at a very early infantile age, and then the new baby is born and the baby carries the grief. So Pluto, you know, is one of those planets. You know, I can't turn it into anything other than what it is, and it's a symbol of grief and existential loss.
These houses are empty.
Yeah.
Is there any significance?
Well, you still have a sign ruling it, and then you would look at the complex form between planets that rule them. So the ruler of the fourth and the eighth and the 12th, what are they doing? Now, it's a little more subtle. It doesn't mean that you don't have a family and you don't have ancestors, and it means that it's a little more subtle. It's just a bit like coming from a really benign family and having this really irrational fear. You don't quite know how to source it. It's a little trickier. In some ways, people have really harsh aspects or very direct planets are in some way a little more fortunate because they can actually say, this is what happens. Or like, I broke my leg, that's why I can't walk. Or my mother drank and beat me, that's why I have this problem. But if everybody seemed to be all right, what are you complaining about? It makes it harder for people, you know? Yes?
Could you address the elements, like
I can't. I don't have time. I'm really sorry, but yes. Yeah, sorry, I'm not trying to sell books, but at the same time. So, I mean, to finish, I have to finish this because otherwise we will have an incomplete tape. When life actually meets, eighth house place in between. Oh, right, because it lies between the initial contact of one's own self, seventh house, and others, like the gods, the ninth house. So it's also the meeting place of the self and the gods. And I think that it's important that we think in terms, too, that the eighth house connects us not to our own cultural ancestors, but also, some of them, occasionally, to specific properties or linguistics of other cultures. Now, if you see what I mean, some people are actually, for some reason, more attracted to Turkey or India and have actually departed from their ancestral line. There may not be an Indian in your background, but something has taken place in the mysterious realm. And in this vein, I think because we're always searching beyond and we're looking for the meaning of the cipher, we're looking for the answer to the problem, and we're trying to find oracles and rituals, and astrology is one of them. I think 8th house people are always probing far inner regions, and therefore are dangerously susceptible to total ego loss periodically, or high inflation resulting from having stood far too long on the edge and looking over. And there's a wonderful poem in the Iliad, or sorry, in the Aeneid, which is one of Virgil's books, when Aeneas, the hero, seeks entry into the underworld, and he solicits the advice of an oracle, the Sibyl. She warns Aeneas of the hazards lying ahead of him in his impending descent into Avernus, which was the Latin term for hell or Hades. And Avernus is interesting because it means birdless. What an awful concept. The Hades is birdless. I mean, when I read that, I went, pooh. Now, the poem is, the descent into Avernus is easy. Pluto's door is always open all the day and night. But to recall the steps, to escape to the upper air, that is the work. That is the labor. And so, therefore, bringing back the knowledge of the exploration through the 8th house is of ultimate importance. Holding it within doesn't work. It has to be brought out. Otherwise, that's where it becomes toxic and dangerous, and that's why people are afraid of the 8th house. If it's expressed, or you can find a way of peeling back the layers of your personal unconscious to get to the core of a family issue or a family complex, analyze it, because the 8th house is very Freudian as opposed to Jungian, which is the 12th house, you may actually be able to contact the source of a problem or an issue in the family, and thus help resolve it, and making the next generation increasingly less focused on that particular problem, because there's always going to be a problem. Now, let's leave it as that, because obviously our time has run out, and but I hope to have left you with something to think about anyway regarding your own attitude towards your families. Thank you.